Matthew chapter 7, verses 13 and 14. Enter by the narrow gate, for the gate is wide, and the way is easy that leads to destruction, and those who enter by it are many. For the gate is narrow, and the way is hard that leads to life, and those who find it are few.
Good morning, everyone. If you want to open your Bibles and go to Matthew's Gospel, chapter 7. It was in August of 1949 that there were about 15 smoke jumpers parachuted down into a pretty remote wilderness fire in Montana called the Mann Gulch Fire. And I think only maybe but 3 of them died. Were either killed or mortally burned. And something very interesting happened. There was a foreman named Wag Dodge. And when the fire had jumped the gulch that they were in, Wag Dodge was below a number of the men that were kind of racing uphill for their lives to try to beat the fire that was roaring up behind them and try to get to this ridgetop where they would be safe. And Wag Dodge kind of saw the wall of fire that was behind him and concluded that it was pretty futile to try to outrun this fire up a very steep hill. And so what he did was that he lit a fire right in front of him called an escape fire. And he burned out a bunch of the fuel right there in the vicinity of where he was. And when he started to do this, he began to call uphill to his men to come back down there and to get with him in doing that. And they looked down there and they thought that was absolutely crazy. And they wouldn't abort their attempts to try to race to the top of the ridge. Well, it turned out that Dodge's plan worked, and he was able to lie down in the burned out area, and the fire ended up burning around him and not over him, and caught up with most of the men and burned right over their backs. And most of them died. And I thought it was interesting, as I thought, that what looked like certain death to many of those men turned out to be life. And what looked like life to many of those men turned out to be death. There's a way that seems right to a man, and in the end it leads to death. And there is a way that can seem wrong to a man, and in the end it leads to life. We are entering into the home stretch in Jesus' Sermon on the Mount as we begin in verse 13 this morning. And as we get into this home stretch, we're going to find that Jesus is not introducing new material in this sermon about what practicing kingdom righteousness really looks like. In fact, what he does is he begins to make a series of contrasts as he starts to wind things down. And there are these sort of opposite pairings. 2 types of this and 2 types of that and 2 types of this other thing. And so there's 2 gates and there's 2 ways and there's 2 destinations, and there's 2 types of trees that bear 2 types of fruit, and there's 2 types of professing worshipers, and there's 2 types of builders that construct on 2 different types of foundations and get 2 very different types of outcomes. And what he's really doing is he's challenging the hearers to make a right response to him. Like, now that I'm here, and now that I'm saying these things to you, what are you going to do with what I'm telling you? And so in making these contrasts, he's really challenging his hearers to make a right response to him and to be warned about those who might cause you to make a wrong response to Him. And so this is where we'll be in the next couple of weeks. So let's just do 13 and 14 this morning. Let's go ahead and stand. Matthew's Gospel, chapter 7. We'll read this together. And there we go. And we will honor God's word. Enter by the narrow gate, for the gate is wide. All right, this is the word of the Lord, and you can be seated. So here, Jesus says that there are two different gates that we can go through. There are two different paths that we can travel down, and there are two different endings that we can experience. And all mankind can only go through one of these two gates and can only be found walking on one of these two paths and can only reach one of these two endings. And one leads to abundant life in the heavenly kingdom of God. And one leads to everlasting ruin. Now, most of Christ's original audience that would be around him and hearing him for this very first time are a Jewish audience. And so they would have high interest in inheriting God's kingdom and participating in the salvation blessings of the future age to come, because their Old Testament scriptures would have groomed that expectation in them. And many of them would be counting on their Jewishness to, in a sense, get them in. That we are the biological, natural descendants of Abraham, the chosen people of God that He formed for His own praise and glory. And so, of course, we're going to be included in this kingdom. But what Jesus is telling these listeners, and us by extension, is don't assume that kingdom inclusion is going to be this automatic thing. And that, most of you are just going to kind of be guaranteed, to get in, unless you're sort of the worst of the worst. In fact, He indicates that most miss out on making it in, and few will actually make it in. And that's hard to hear. But it's what He has to say, and so we'll face into it. So, we'll start with the narrow gate. Enter by the narrow gate. And the narrow gate, simply put, is Jesus. Jesus is the King who has come down to us from God. And the kingdom is His to give. And the kingdom is His to establish in the earth. And He alone has the real righteousness of God. And nobody else does. And He unveils for us what that righteousness is in the Sermon on the Mount. And He alone is the one that can be that is able to give us that righteousness in a gifted form. And not only give us that righteousness in a gifted form where it's attributed to us or credited to us through our belief in Him, but He's actually able to work out that interchange inside of us so that we can begin to conform our lives around that righteousness and be formed in that righteousness and walk in that righteousness as He walked in this world. He is the narrow gate. And this path, this difficult path or this narrow path, is us following Jesus in His way of things. and taking His yoke upon us and embracing this life of authentic submission to King Jesus. And it's called a difficult path, because this discipleship that He calls us into is in the shape of a cross. And there are these self-denying requirements that He lays down for us to enter into this life of discipleship, where self doesn't get to be the center of authority. Self has to be set aside to make room for Jesus to really be Lord in us and to really do His thing in us and be visible in us. And so it's a difficult path in that way, and it's also a narrow path. You know, I used to backpack in the Indian Heaven Wilderness of Washington State, and there would be some times where the path would like narrow down to something like that wide, and it would be like that deep from years and I'd be walking through a meadow, and it's almost like you're like walking on a balance beam. You know, it's your footsteps have already been chosen for you when you're on a path that narrow. There's just not room for you to just kind of range back and forth, and right. And that's why it's a narrow path. Is you're performing the will of another now. You're serving the desires of another. Your footsteps have already been chosen for you. It can't be a self-willed path where everyone just kind of gets to range to and fro and do their own thing. And it's called narrow because there's no other way. There's 1,000 ways to perish, but there's only one way to be saved. And it's like Jesus is telling the world, like, I am it. I am your only shot at obtaining eternal life. If you want to avoid everlasting ruin, your options are one. Like, the list is one. And you come in through Christ, or you don't come in at all. It's ruling out all other options and excluding all other ways in the narrowness of what it really is. And he says, few find it. Few find it. And I thought it would be worth asking, why do few find it? Well, for one reason, it's not because God is playing hide and seek with it. That's not why few find it. One reason that few find it is because many people know their need to go through that narrow gate, but they put it off. And they put it off, and they put it off, and I'm going to get around to it later someday. And then later someday doesn't come because your life ends sooner than you thought. Or later someday does come, but now your heart is in a very different place. And you may not see with the clarity that you see with right now your need to go through that narrow gate 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 30 years. You may be a different person. And in fact, the more you say no to God and keep pushing God away and saying no to God, the more your heart is probably guaranteed to get more stubborn over time. And so that's one reason why few find it. There's other reasons why few find it, is that from the outside looking in, it looks restrictive. It looks restrictive. And looking restrictive, it just looks ruinous to all joy. Like this is just going to make a miserable slave out of me, just serving the will of another person. How could you ever be happy doing that? Where you don't get to make it about you, and now you get to make it about somebody else. And that's just going to make some dour, sour, gloomy slave out of me. So it's not a very inviting or appealing path from the outside looking in. But then I think there's another reason that few find it, is that we have fears. We have fears that happen around the narrow gate. I think one of our fears is that if I go through the narrow gate, then God is going to sort of search out that thing inside of me that I dread the most and then make sure that's what I get. Right? That's our view of God. Like, oh, so you don't want to be a missionary in some snake-infested, sweaty jungle. Well, wait in store for what I have for you, So we have those fears. Right? Or we think it's going to make some sort of religious crazy nut job out of me. And I'm going to be like some weird, whacked out guy that nobody can relate to. I'm going to be like one of those angry people shouting damnation at everyone on a street corner, or some sort of celluloid TV Christian, or with a plastered perma-smile and a geometric hairdo or whatever. Like, that's who I'm going to become, and I won't be able to inhabit the thought world that the average person inhabits, right? So have that fear about, Satan helps those fears along, doesn't he? He's really good. Yeah, absolutely. That is what will happen. I mean, all the misery and bad times are over here on God's side of things, and all the fun and the freedom and the fulfillment is over here on this end of things. What's interesting, there's a lot of intense warfare that happens around the narrow gate as people get close to that. And what I think is interesting is that John Bunyan, in his allegory of the Christian's life, The Pilgrim's Progress, he caught that. He caught that. And when the pilgrims would get to the wicket gate that they would have to go through to enter onto the King's Highway and begin traveling to the celestial city, there was a hand that reached through, came thrusting through that gate and pulled them in very, very quickly. And then they looked behind them and they saw all of these arrows stuck in the trees and in the ground. And they said, "What is this about?" And they said, "Well, the king's enemy has built a castle nearby, and he has commanded his servants that whenever a pilgrim gets near that wicket gate to fire a volley of arrows at them. Satan does not want you going through that narrow gate." And so he's going to help a lot of those irrational fears. Another fear that we have about passing through the narrow gate, and I think this is that we look at it and we think, I'll never make it. I'll never make it out on this narrow path of rugged discipleship. Like, it's going to ask of me more than I'm truly capable of giving. Or I'm going to fall down when I get out on that narrow path. And here's what Satan won't tell you, but God wants you to know, is that path is soaked with grace. It is drenched with grace for when you stumble on that path. And we all stumble in many ways, to restore you to that path. It's a grace-saturated path. And it's not a path where God is asking you to get out on that path and be strong in the strength of your own might. He is just asking you to let His strength be sufficient for what we already are, and that is weak in our weakness. And it's a path where His grace equips you, and His grace enables you and gives you everything you need, inwardly and outwardly, to do all that He requires and asks of you. It's full of grace in all of those ways. It's the narrow path. Now let's talk about the wide gate and the broad path. If the narrow gate is called narrow because it's just Jesus, then the wide gate is called wide because it's everything that's not Jesus. It's a very roomy road. And it makes room for everything else that is not the biblical Jesus. It's all other routes that you can take in life. You can think of it as a crazy wide freeway with multiple lanes. And all of those lanes are like encompassing a vast diversity of viewpoints and worldviews and life philosophies and spiritualities and practices, and religious and non-religious. It's like a supermarket of ideas about how to do life are on the wide road. And a cartload of life pursuits are on that wide road. All sorts of traditions. And Jesus said, and many are those who enter by it. It's like teeming hordes of people are pouring down that path. And it's immensely popular, and it's most go there on that path. Now, I thought it would be a good thing for us to do, to just do a little cross-section of who might be found on that path. And I think when we would do this, there's this danger that we don't analyze ourselves. We always need to be evaluating ourselves first before we think about anybody else. And I just am afraid that in Christendom at large, there are many people that are on that path, because what they're trying to do is they're trying to hang on to their life and have a little Jesus on the side. Like life goes better with a glass of Jesus. But I'm still making it about me, or I'm still making it about something else that's not Jesus. That is a very dangerous way to try to live out your faith. And remember what Jesus said, that those who try to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for His sake will find it. So let's just analyze ourselves first. But then let's think about who else we might find on that path, right? We might find on that path, well, who's right in front of Christ at the time? You have law-keeping Jews. You're going to have people who are trying to work their way to heaven by being a good religious person. And if I can just do enough of what God commands in His law, it will gain me a place in God's kingdom. Or you would have people that would be counting on their Jewishness to get them in as natural descendants of Abraham. Today, it might be the person who is counting on their denominational belonging. And their I'm under the right denominational covering. And that's got me covered with God. And so they're counting on that, or they're counting on some special class of clergy who can perform some sort of last rites on your deathbed to kind of stuff you into the kingdom last minute. And they're putting their hope in that. You'll find that person on that path. You'll find other people. This is going to be a while, so just settle. We're in this for a little bit now, okay? So you're going to find the rugged independent type, right? Who thinks that God is a crutch for weak people, and I can get way more out of life and go much farther in life if I just work on being my own best resource and make myself strong in my own ways. And you'll have that person out on that path. You'll have another kind of person on that path, and that's the person who sort of thinks that sort of the great purpose of life is to display your individuality. As if the answer key to life is you being authentic to you. And so you need to look inside of yourself, because those are where the true secrets and mysteries of life are found. Look inside of you, look at your core, discover your longings, whatever those desires are, whatever those bents are, whatever those attractional impulses are, whatever that stuff is, let that out. Just let it out and live it out, because you doing you is the hope of glory. Right? So that person is out on that path. And you're going to have others, it's a very sin-cherishing path. You're going to have people on that path that are just pursuing the passing pleasures of sin with their life. They're just bouncing from one thrill-seeking thing to another, one adrenaline high to another, one thing that gratifies the flesh to another. You might find on that path the person who is just trying to chase all their good things now Just trying to chase all my good things now and grab at as much as I can get for myself now because I only go around once. And you're going to have that person on that path. You're going to have another kind of person on that path. It's the person who's trying to discover the divinity within them. That someone convinced them that you are God. And you need to get in touch with that God spark that's in you and just let that out. You might have on that path the person who has staked their life to this fundamental belief in human goodness. Not human depravity, but human goodness. That man is the measure of all things. And that man can mount all of his obstacles, and man can solve all of his problems. And if we can just cooperate and pull together, we can create that super society for ourselves that will truly meet the deepest needs of humanity, and we will have created a better destiny for ourselves apart from God than we ever could through God. And you'll have that humanist on that path. You might have on that path the person with the bumper sticker that says, "He who dies with the most toys wins." You might have on that path the person who is building their whole life on the avoidance of pain. You will have on that path the person who is trying to obtain oneness with the universe and channel universal energy, or through meditative techniques to try to reach some sort of state of conscious enlightenment. All of the counterfeit Christian cults are on that path. All of the people that went after some prophet that appeared later in time and basically in their own words said, "I have the rest of the story that Jesus never told you. But He's told it to me, and you need me to get to God. So follow me." You'll have on that path the person who has put way more faith in science than they do biblical revelation. That science is how we know all things there are to know. And science explains everything there is to know about this phenomena of human existence on planet Earth. You'll have on that path, and this is my last one, an environmentalist with a capital E, who sees the environment as supreme. We owe our existence to nature, and therefore we owe our highest allegiance to nature. And we serve it, and we enjoy it with the fiercest devotion, even people-hating devotion, because people are just a scourge and a blight on planet Earth. And that person will be on that path. On and on. You see how roomy it is? Makes room for all of that. Everything you could want and then some. Everything that is not the biblical Jesus is on that superhighway. And here's what I want you to think about, and it's kind of why I brought up that whole Man Gulch fire, is that people have chosen those things because those things were made to look like life. People didn't choose those things because they could see how that's going to blow up their life in the end. That's not why they chose it. They chose it because those things were made to look like life. And that's the problem with doing life in a world that lies under the power of the evil one. And that lies under the power of indwelling sin in our flesh that deceives us and lies to us and makes all sorts of false promises to us. You understand that it makes death look like life, and it makes what God says is true life look like death. It is the vast deception and darkness that covers this this society of people down here is that life is made to look like death, and what God says is death is made to look like life. And people have chosen those things because those things were made to look like life. Like, this is what's going to make me happy, or this is what's going to liberate my humanity and truly launch me into the very best version of me there could ever be. Or this is what's going to connect me to ultimate reality. Or this is what's going to make me more woke and enlightened than everybody else. This is what's going to be the ticket to truly being a good person. This is what's going to create a winner out of me in life. Whatever it is, it was made to look like life. But there is a way that seems right to a man, and in the end, God says it leads to death. And if there was ever a placard that you could put over the wide gate, that would be it. And if there was a placard you could put over the narrow gate, it might be this: there is a way that seems wrong to a man, but in the end, it leads to life. Because the narrow way is not inviting outside looking in. It doesn't look appealing. It doesn't look attractive. It's not sexy like all those other things can be. Last thing I want to say before we begin transitioning to communion is that there is an antagonistic relationship between the narrow way and the wide way. The narrow way offends the wide way. Yes, it does. Because it judges everything else on the wide way to be wrong. And the wide way does not appreciate the narrow way doing that. I mean, just think about the cultural moment that you live in. Just think about your social location in, like, one of the nastiest things that you can be called right now is narrow. Right? It's like that's a nasty word, to be called narrow. That you are narrow-minded. To be called narrow is basically to be told that you are a bad person. You are a bad... and I'm just going to tell you, the exclusivity of Christ is one of the most contentious points to the Christian faith. Right? Because what do we want right now? We want this pluralistic super society that celebrates everything. We celebrate all perspectives. We celebrate all viewpoints. We bless all worldviews. It's all honored here. It's all equally good. It's all equally right. It's all equally true. And none will be judged to be more wrong or right than another. Right? It's all about diversity and embracing this vast diversity of lenses to look at life through. This is why you can be a freshman student and go to a college public university. Go to a public university and show up and say, I'm on a quest for truth and I'm excited to be here. Right? And we're excited to have you here. This is a wonderful place to conduct your quest for truth. And you get to try out all sorts of ideas and experiment with all sorts of things and find yourself through it all. And we're so happy to have you here as you on your quest for truth. But as soon as you say, and I have found the truth, and I have found it, and I have found what is transcendently true, and timelessly true, and universally true, and absolutely true for everyone, then no, that's imperialistic hate speech, man. You can't be doing that. Man, that's so insensitive to people of other faiths and no faiths and other points of view and perspectives. I don't feel safe in that conversation, right? That's where that goes. No, that fine. You found Jesus, that works for you. He's true for you. He doesn't work for me. It's not true for me. It's this age of relativism that we live in. There's no such thing as absolute truth. I'd like to critique that for a little bit. First of all, as Ravi Zacharias points out, that is a mess of a statement. There is no such thing as absolute truth, except there is no such thing as absolute truth. That's a statement that can't even bear under its own logical weight. Do you get that? Right? Okay, well, never mind that. We'll put that one aside. That's like taking candy from a baby. The second problem with this idea of, well, that works for you, but it doesn't work for me, is guys, we don't come to Jesus because Jesus works for us. That's not why we come to Jesus. I don't come to Jesus and just sort of, I'm going to try him on for a while. You know, he turned out to work for me, kind of like a nice pair of clothes, just fits just right. That's not why most people come to Jesus and find he doesn't fit just right. There's a lot of dying to self I have to do to fit into him, right? That's not why we come to Jesus, because he works for me. We come to Jesus because Jesus is the only thing that works with God. We come to him whether or not he works for me, because he is the only thing that works with God. And he is who our Creator commends to us. God has a right to determine how people approach him. And he has commanded us to seek him in his appointed way through his anointed king, or we can't find him in his saving favor. And my third issue with relativism is nobody actually lives that way down here. We love to drop the relativity card when it comes to spiritual conversations, but nobody actually, it's not something you can consistently live out down here in the world below. We don't sit there and say, well, gravity works for you, man, but gravity doesn't work for me. And so you can jump off the building and you're going to go splat like a bug, but I'm going to jump off the building and just kind of float down like a feather, because gravity doesn't work for me the way it works. We don't live that way down here. We don't, well, how do you get to this website? Type in any address you want. It'll get you there. It's all good. No, it's not. You want to find that website? There's a very specific address to get to that website. And we don't live that way down. Someone's a relativist until they've been falsely charged for a crime they didn't commit and they're facing 20 years. Now we're interested in truth as opposed to what is not truth. Now we're interested into something that has a factual basis in reality that rules out all other potentials. Now suddenly we're not a relativist anymore in that scenario. You want to go up and see a relativist eating food at a food court in a mall and they got their wallet sitting out on the table, just walk up and take their wallet. Hey, that's mine. Well, that's true for you, but that's not true for me. No, there's reasons to think that my truth is more right than your truth, and that this is objectively under my ownership and not yours, right? We don't live like relativists down here. But as soon as we get into spiritual conversations, as soon as we want to talk about the metaphysical and the supernatural, we drop the relativity card. Okay. So, the narrow way offends the wide way. It also offends the wide way for other reasons, is that we really want to try to broker peace at all costs. We want to just be able to pronounce peace to everything in the name of getting along. And so we like to come up with different ways of blessing everything. We might say things like, well, all religions are just different angles of coming at the same God by. Right? Or all religions are just different manifestations of one ultimate reality. I mean, if you sort of think of divine ultimate reality as a puzzle, each religion has been given a puzzle piece. And if we can just put all those puzzle pieces together, then we get the full picture. Never mind that those puzzle pieces are saying things that are mutually exclusive and contradictory of one another, and often diametrically opposed to one another in the claims that they're making. But forget that. They're all paths lead to God. Now, what are we saying when we say that all paths lead to God? What we're really saying when we say that all paths lead to, and I want you to challenge people when they say this, is we're saying it's impossible to be wrong about God. That's what we're really saying. It's impossible to be wrong about God. That whatever I imagine God to be, whatever I come up with, whatever I assign to him, attribute to him, believe about him, think about him, conclude about him, it's all guaranteed to be right. It's impossible to be wrong about God, and therefore all paths lead to God. What rational basis does that rest on? That is standing on thin air, because we know that down here in this world below that came from the world above, it's possible to be wrong about all sorts of things, isn't it? And we often are wrong about all sorts of things. And so, if it's possible for us to be wrong about lesser realities, what would make us think that it's impossible for us to be wrong about the greatest reality that there is? But I think even more, if we just keep peeling the onion layers back, is that we want to determine our own truth. Because it's the ancient lie that the serpent tempted us with in the Edenic paradise of our first parents. You can be like God, knowing good and evil. You get to be your judge of good and evil. You get to determine what is true and what is not true. You get to decide what is right and what is wrong. You don't have to work off God's standard. You become your own standard and make everything else adjust to that. And that is the serpent's bite, working its way through our thinking in that regard. The narrow way offends the wide way. But guys, if we're going to stand with Jesus on the narrow way, we have to embrace the offense of the narrow way. And be okay that it disturbs the darkness of the wide way. The narrow way is a lonely path because few find it. More are not walking it than are walking it. That's why we need this. That's why we need each other. That's why we can't surrender community for very long. The exclusivity of Christ, as we think about communion, the exclusivity of Christ is ultimately about God's heart of inclusivity. Right? That's what the narrow way is about, God making a way where there was no other way. That's what the narrow way is about. God making a way where there was no other way for a holy God to dwell with an unholy people and coexist in harmony in His eternal dwellings. That's what the narrow way is about. It's about a God that wants to welcome people in, a God who devised a way where there was no other way for that to happen. It's ultimately about His heart of inclusivity that has prepared a kingdom for people to inherit from every tribe and nationality and tongue. And there's another reason that I know it's about God's heart of inclusivity is because the narrow way is sourced in grace. That He might guarantee it to all. Because as soon as you make it about something other than grace, you start ruling out vast swaths of people. When you start making it about racial heritage, when you start making it about human achievement, when you start making it about IQ and intellect, or whose life looks more put together than another, or whatever, as soon as you start making it about that, and that's now the gate, then you start ruling out lots of people. But when you make it about grace, then who can't get in that wants to get in? And everyone can get in that wants to get in if they're willing to go in God's appointed way. You see, the narrow way is not about a curmudgeon of a creator up there tabulating how many people can I keep out of my kingdom. This is about a God who is throwing wide open the gates to His kingdom and saying, come. Come through the way that I made where there was no other way. I split the Red Sea so you can walk right through it. Now go walk right through it. That's what this is about. And so that brings us to communion this morning. Jesus is what it takes for our Creator to be both just in His response to human evil and the justifier of the ungodly. Where perfect justice and perfect mercy collide and coincide at the cross. That He Himself bore our sins in His body to bring us back to God. That we might die to sin and live to righteousness. For by His wounds you have been healed. For we all, like sheep, have gone astray, but have now returned to the chief shepherd and overseer of our souls. And so if you have a faith relationship with the Jesus of the Bible, I invite you to come and to take communion. And just for your faith to participate in the shed blood and broken body of God's Son in a tangible way where you can taste and see that the Lord is good. So let's come forward. Let's take communion as a church family right now, and then Angie will call us back when it's time.